Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder how we even know what numbers are, or how we feel that sense of how many things there are? It's a deep question that philosophers and scientists have wrestled with for ages. But what if the answer lies not just in our brains, but in the very fabric of our consciousness? Today we're diving into some fascinating research that tries to explain that fundamental feeling of how many, what scientists call numerosity, using a really cool theory about consciousness. They're not just looking at brain activity, but at the experience itself. So we've been doing math forever, right? From counting sheep to building pyramids. But what is math, and how do we even grasp abstract concepts like numbers? We know parts of the brain light up when we do math. Studies show areas like the intraparietal sulci and the inferior temporal gyrus are involved. For complex math, the prefrontal cortex gets busy too. It seems like math is deeply connected to our sense of space. But here is the big mystery. We don't really know how these mathematical ideas feel to us from the inside. How do we experience 2 or 3 or 100? This is crucial because our experience is likely how we first grasp and then manipulate mathematical concepts. There are many theories about consciousness, but this research zeroes in on one called Integrated Information Theory, or IIT. IIT is different because it starts from our own subjective experience. It says consciousness is the one thing we know for sure, from the inside. Then it tries to figure out how our physical brain creates that experience. It works by identifying fundamental properties of experience, called axioms, and then figuring out what kind of physical systems could possibly create those experiences. The goal is to map the structure of consciousness, which IIT calls a phi, or structure, using cause and effect distinctions. The more integrated information a system has, the more conscious it is. The researchers thought IIT might be perfect for understanding mathematical experience, especially since it's already been used to explain how we experience space. So, they looked at a basic mathematical idea, numerosity. They wanted to understand the feeling of how many things we perceive. Now, it's important to know what they mean by numerosity here. It is not necessarily about knowing the exact number 3 with all its properties. It's more about the basic sense of some things versus more things. Think of it as the raw feeling of 2-ness or 3-ness before you start counting or comparing sizes. They distinguish this from quantity, which is more about how much of something there is, like area or duration. And guess what? We're pretty good at this from a very young age. Even babies and animals show a sense of how many we can often subitize, meaning we can instantly tell how many items there are, up to about 4, without even trying to count. Beyond that, we use an approximate number system, which is like a rough estimate that gets less precise as the number of items increases. Eventually, this rough system can develop into a more precise, exact number system for counting. But explaining the feeling of numerosity is tricky. First, how does this connect to actual math? In everyday life, we might say a few or lots. But in mathematics, numerosity means the size of a set, like how many elements are in it. Second, the brain areas involved in math can vary a lot from person to person, making it hard to pinpoint a single location. And IIT itself can be tough to test directly with current technology. So, what did this paper do? They proposed that the feeling of numerosity, both how many things there are quantity, and what that feeling is like quality, can be explained by the patterns of connections between distinctions within a structure. They argue this comes directly from IITs without needing extra assumptions. They start by saying that any unity we experience, like a distinct dot or a single musical note, is actually a distinction in the structure. This is fundamental to IIT. A distinction exists because it has a cause and an effect that are distinct enough from everything else to have a clear identity. Then, they identify what makes these distinctions specifically about numerosity. They suggest that the feeling of 2-ness, for instance, comes from a distinction having certain kinds of relationships with other distinctions. The number of these relationships, called cardinality, seems to be key to the quantity of numerosity. For example, the distinction for 1 might relate to one thing, while the distinction for 2 relates to 2 different things. The type of these relationships show they connect or nest within each other explains the quality of the feeling. And this is where it gets really interesting. They propose that the feeling of numerosity is shaped by order structures. Imagine these as patterns of relationships between distinctions. These patterns give context to the numerosity feeling. They give 3 examples first, the rhythmic 1-2-1-2 of a march. This could be a simple binary order structure. Second, the feeling of rhythm in music like Anders Schnenblau and Donau. This could involve more complex hierarchical structures, like how beats group into measures and measures into phrases. Third, experiencing two dots in a 10-base system. This could be an on-off structure where 2 is on, but the higher tens place is off, sort of like a placeholder. They even have a figure showing these potential patterns. It's not showing what the brain looks like, but rather how the connections of distinctions in a structure could represent these different ways of experiencing numerosity. So, to sum up this part, the quantity of what we feel how many comes from the number of connections a distinction has, and the quality of that feeling comes from the type of connection. A cool idea here is that even if the actual things we were perceiving disappear, the feeling of numerosity can persist. Like remembering you heard 8 notes in a melody, this is because the order structure in the structure can maintain its pattern of connections like a template even when the specific sensory input is gone. So, in their discussion, they reiterate that they've shown how the feeling of numerosity can be understood from IIT's basic principles. They believe the quantity and quality of numerosity are explained by these connectivity patterns, not just by a specific brain function. This gives a new way to think about all those brain studies. Instead of looking for one specific brain spot for numbers, they suggest it's the pattern of integrated connections within a conscious cause-effect structure that matters. This explains why math activity can show up in different brain areas for different people or in different situations. It's about the information flowing and being processed, not just a fixed hardware location, and it helps explain why brain areas linked to space are often active during math. Perhaps the way these spatial grids are structured makes them naturally suited for building these mathematical order structures. They do acknowledge that their examples are not complete explanations yet. More complex math and more intricate order structures would need a lot more investigation. The biggest hurdles are still experimental. It is hard to track all the tiny details of our rich experiences, and our current brain recording and computing technology have limitations when it comes to IIT. They also touch on the idea of unconscious math processing. They suggest that maybe these aren't truly unconscious, but rather mechanisms that have a smaller impact on the main conscious experience. It's neat that this idea fits with how we think numbers might have first come about as a way to describe the things we encounter in the world, starting with simple counting. Even the concept of 0, initially a placeholder, can be understood within these order structures. So, in conclusion, this research offers a compelling argument that the feeling of numerosity is an intrinsic property of consciousness itself. Explained by the way distinctions are connected within a structure, it's not about math explaining consciousness, but rather consciousness explaining mathematics from the inside out. They suggest future work could explore more abstract mathematical ideas like zero negative numbers and infinity and see if IIT can account for them too. Imagine if the entire field of mathematics could be explained through these intrinsic structures. This is really thought-provoking stuff. It shifts the focus from just looking at neurons firing to understanding the fundamental nature of experience itself. It suggests that our subjective feelings, like the sense of how many, might be the very building blocks of our mathematical understanding. What I find most exciting about this is the idea of intrinsic mathematics. It's a beautiful concept that the laws of math might not be out there in some abstract realm, but are deeply woven into the structure of conscious experience. It makes you wonder about the very nature of reality and how we perceive it. Of course, like any research, there are limitations. The empirical testing is difficult, and there are still many unanswered questions about how consciousness and attention interact with these mathematical ideas. But that's what makes science exciting, Therese, always more to explore. This research pushes us to think about consciousness in a whole new way, not just as a product of brain function, but as something that has its own inherent structure that can even give rise to abstract concepts like numbers. It's a complex idea, but one that opens up a world of possibilities for understanding ourselves and the universe. So, what do you think? Does this idea that our feelings of how many are fundamental to math resonate with you? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this dive into the mind, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration. Until then, keep questioning, keep wondering, and keep exploring the incredible landscape of the mind.